Welcome back to Mayo Clinic Radio. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Cozine.
And I'm Tracy McRae.
Today's children are growing up in an age where technology and screen time are a part of life. Many teenagers have access to the internet right in their pockets. And while the cell phone can be used to stay connected to friends, it can also be used to explore the web away from the watchful eyes of parents.
One area of concern for parents of teenagers is access to pornography. How big of a problem is it? And what effects do pornography have on the teenage brain that's still developing? Joining us in studio to discuss are Mayo Clinic psychologist, Dr. Jennifer Wenzel, and Dr. Dagoberto Herrera. Great to have you both here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
This is exciting.
Well, this is a topic that when I brought it up, a lot of people around the table went, ooh, we should probably talk about that, but how do you do that? And I think having both of you here is a great way to get us started. What is the effect that pornography has on teenage brains? Because they are still developing, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think what we've found in the literature that we've looked at is that we still don't quite know. There's not any studies that are out there specifically looking about pornography and its impact on developing brains. What we do know, however, is that because children are still getting used to kind of being autonomous and having difficult conversations, it's the most important time to start setting a framework for having difficult conversations that are comprehensive and that are not shame-based.
It's definitely a different day and age. I mean,
sure.
I'm the oldest one in this room, so I'll just go out and say that, when I was growing up, there was maybe a stack of Playboy magazines someplace when you went over to your uncle's house or whatever that you could find. But literally, teenagers now do have access 24 hours a day. And I think that's a huge bridge for parents, grandparents too, to make what that access to pornography means to kids.
Yeah. Well, and you're certainly right. Humans have created explicit depictions of nudity and sex since the beginning of our species.
Right.
You can actually see this in cave paintings, amazingly enough. And we certainly know that every new technology has been adapted for sexual purposes. Cameras were used for this, video cameras after that. Online chat rooms back in the 90s were used for sexual content. And many of our technologies have been driven by sexual purposes, whether we choose to acknowledge that or not. I'm also thinking of the new Snapchat and other apps that TikTok. Our teenagers are likely to be using and very often more familiar with those than we are as adults.
In ways that we are just really not even aware of. And so you mentioned, Dr. Heredia, kind of thinking about the framework for the discussion of, and so kind of how do we do that as parents? And as, I'm a family doctor, I see kids, I see teenagers, and what is a good way to kind of start with the discussion about, look, all of these these images are often quite normal, but some of them are perhaps not, and is normal even a word that we should be using?
I think that the most important kind of start point for us is to tackle the stigma and taboo that exists around having conversations about sex and sexual health. So I think that in our generation, we will always contend with some degree of taboo that's placed on pornography, but we can make a concerted effort to challenge the taboo that exists in the conversations we have with children. One thing that can be really, really helpful is to ask open-ended questions. Move away from lecture-style discussions and move towards conversations where you're getting a sense for what the child is seeing, the platforms that they're using on their cell phones or tablets, and also have the conversations be as often as possible and as early as possible.
How early as possible?
I am certainly a fan of comprehensive, developmentally and age-appropriate sexual education, and this becomes a piece of that. That is not something that we generally see in our public school systems, but is something that parents absolutely can contribute to. We're seeing more and more resources out there in the world to help parents with these conversations. And as a certified sex therapist and somebody who works in sexual health, this is a conversation that I hear a lot from the patients and clients that I work with, where they have struggled with their own kind of sex negativity and sexual shame, and it becomes kind of a vicious cycle that gets passed down through generations of, well, my parents didn't talk about this, or it was explicitly sort of a negative thing to talk about sex, and so I don't know how to start those conversations with my children. And so
the advice, I'm sorry to interrupt, I just said the advice I often give is it can be really quite simple. Is, you really, from little kids, are just answering the question that was asked. And they kind of shrug their shoulders and walk away.
We don't necessarily need to give them more detail.
But teenagers are trickier.
Yeah, let's guess who's got a teenage son and who's got little kids.
Exactly.
So, but, I know right now there are so many parents that are saying, isn't it a fact, though, if the more that we talk about it, the more curious they will become about seeking out pornography. I'm not going to say that they're not finding it. And
they are
by
finding
me
it.
talking about it, it puts the idea in their head.
Yeah.
I completely understand that's not the case.
There is no empirical evidence to support that. Dr. Heredia mentioned earlier that we have a real dearth in research on teenagers and erotica and pornography, and that's particularly true in this country, but there is a little bit of research out there coming from other countries, some in Europe, Asia, and what we're finding, what those studies are showing us, is that parental monitoring and proactive conversations about sexuality and pornography and potential risk factors for stumbling across this, so to speak, on the internet, actually help reduce rates that teenagers are going to go out looking for these things, and can really impact the behaviors there. And so having these conversations is really critical, keeping in mind our own biases, right? And if we're feeling very negative and very shameful about these things, we have to be really thoughtful about how we're having those conversations.
Mm-hmm. I know that you've already said we're still in the space where we're starting to learn what the teenage brain is developing. What do we know right now about brain development in teens? And, well, just right there, period, when it comes to sexuality, let alone pornography, but sexuality.
Mm-hmm. What we do know is that it's normal for there to be some degree of sexual interest and sexual exploration very early. And because our younger generations are so connected, it makes sense that there would be some degree of exploration and information seeking online. Mm-hmm. And so with that in mind, it's important to kind of get a sense of what it is that the individual is accessing and providing correct information as needed or as necessary.
Why is it? Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say there's a word for this, actually, that we're talking around. It's or a phrase for this called porn literacy.
Yes.
So this is something that, to a small degree, is starting to be researched here in the U.S., although, as we've said, there's a huge dearth in literature in this area. But the idea behind porn literacy, like sexual literacy in general, is that we're giving teenagers and adults, quite frankly, the ability to think critically about the images that they're seeing or the video they're seeing in front of them. So they can think critically about the people that are being portrayed on those pornographic videos. Have they altered their bodies surgically? Is it, in fact, portraying a way toward orgasm that actually does not exist in real life, right? Multiple orgasms that might not be possible because there's been an editing break, right? Constantly, firm erections for hours and hours, things that really paint a really unrealistic picture of sex and sexuality, particularly with partners.
Isn't there something for all of you to be said, though? What I understand about teenage brains is until they get to their mid-20s, all of those pathways are being hooked up. So whether you're playing a video game that is extremely violent or watching a movie that's extremely violent or sexual, whatever, that it affects the way that those pathways are hooked up. Is that how I understand?
Undetermined.
Yeah.
Certainly we know that brains don't finish fully developing until the early 20s. That's been pretty well established in neuroscience literature for a long time. But the impact of violent video games, this is something that we hear a lot kind of in parallel to pornography, that this is going to cause violence or somehow lead to that. And the research is correlational in nature, and that's really important to keep in mind, right? Just because two things are related doesn't mean that one causes the other. And so there are other factors that we have yet to look into. Are there personality variables that maybe lead some folks to these types of materials versus other folks?
I think maybe the question might be, as we know the developing brain perhaps is not fully formed in terms of judgment, how does that affect the conversation that we should be having as kids turning into teens are then exposed to these things that maybe are outside of my sexual norms, but perhaps are within theirs?
I think this is where education around porn literacy really becomes so critical, right? Because children, teens, adolescents can be taught critical thinking skills, and hopefully they are being taught that as they're getting older. That's part of their high school education for sure. This is an area that shouldn't be neglected when we're thinking about helping them build critical thinking skills. They need to be able to critically analyze what they're seeing because they are seeing it.
We're talking about teens and pornography with two Mayo Clinic experts, Dr. Jennifer Wenzel and Dr. Dagoberto Heredia. It's time for a short break.
And next up, myth or fact. Young men are going to sex therapists with erectile dysfunction because of pornography.
Ooh, we'll find out.
Okay. Welcome back to Mayo Clinic Radio. Dr. Wenzel, can you answer our myth or matter of fact?
I will try.
Wait a minute. We need to
introduce that more.
Introduce yourself.
Welcome back to Mayo Clinic Radio. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Cozine.
And I'm Tracy McCrae. We are talking with two Mayo Clinic psychologists, Dr. Jennifer Wenzel and Dr. Dagberto Herrera. And it's time for Myth or Matter of Fact.
Myth or matter of fact. Do young men who are coming into sex therapists with erectile dysfunction, is it because of pornography?
Is that a myth or a fact?
Given the empirical evidence that we have right now, I would say myth. What we are seeing in terms of the research that has been out there, that has been published, is that despite pretty emotionally charged media accounts and some self-help sites that are really sort of perpetuating this idea that pornography is causing erectile dysfunction or other sexual functioning concerns, particularly in men. Interestingly, women are never included as part of that conversation. That's a whole other story. Despite some of those accounts that we're seeing in the media, the research evidence is not really backing this up. There are a few studies out there to suggest that men who report a preference for masturbating while they watch pornography over partnered sexual experiences are at higher risk for erectile dysfunction. That is not necessarily attributable to pornography, however. If you think about what is a common factor in erectile dysfunction, performance anxiety, difficulty being in your body and staying kind of focused in that moment sexually, it makes sense that if you are anxious in performing with a partner that you may prefer not to be with a partner sexually and may actually prefer solo stimulation through masturbation.
So for our listeners at home, what you're clearing up is that that man may be having erections just fine within the setting that he prefers.
Correct.
And so we're labeling it as dysfunction because in the setting that perhaps the partner prefers, it doesn't work.
Correct. And it is very common to see performance anxiety as a part of erectile functioning concerns. And so to attribute that directly to pornography or explicitly erotic media, the research certainly hasn't bared support for that, at least as of this point.
And when it is connected, what does happen is that, again, shame is attached to pornography or sexual interest or sexual exploration. And when that happens, that can be something that sets the stage for erectile dysfunction or premature or delayed ejaculation. What's important, though, is to remember that it's not about like you having caught your partner looking at porn or you having caught your teen looking at porn. It's more about recognizing that there's interest going on and there's conversations to be had. Not necessarily shaming, because that would just lead to kind of silencing and secretive behavior.
During the break, we were talking about the idea of viewing pornography leads teenagers into early sexual situations, and you said it's actually the opposite if they're have got good sex ed.
Yeah, so there is a lot of political controversy around this issue, and I don't bring up this topic to be political, but to talk more about the research that's out there and the research support and evidence for comprehensive, developmentally appropriate, age-appropriate sexual education. We know consistently that providing comprehensive sexual education, which includes porn literacy, pornography literacy, and helping adolescents to think more critically about sexually explicit media, we know that that actually has outcomes that include delaying first sexual experiences. And we think that that's because they're actually feeling less like they want to take risks, that they are kind of curious, so they're just going to go ahead and do it and see what it's about.
Empowered with knowledge.
Yeah. Right, empowered, wonderful way to say that, yes.
One of the things that you mentioned that we should be sure to include in this conversation, it wasn't even on my list, on my radar, but it is the legal ramifications of pornography for teenagers versus adults. So explain what you mean by that.
Well, currently in Minnesota, there are no laws that exist that are specific to things like sexting. But what we are seeing is an increase in litigation around creating and disseminating images that are produced by teens on platforms like Snapchat.
Which is really difficult for people of even my generation to understand. I'm a Zennial, between X and Millennial, but so Snapchat, doesn't it just disappear? So how is it captured? I mean, that might be a question our listeners have.
Yeah, well, it can disappear, and oftentimes it does, but you can still take screenshots. Okay. And there are softwares and other apps that exist to where you can take a screenshot and it wouldn't let the other person know that a screenshot was being taken. And so, again, it's important to have age-appropriate and comprehensive sex education, but in a manner that also includes new technologies like Snapchat, TikTok, and so on, and also the limitations that exist around them.
Parents have to take a tech literacy class in addition to their sex literacy
well,
class.
What is important for parents to know here, as Dr. Heredia mentioned in terms of increased litigation, so we're seeing minors, adolescents being charged with child pornography possession and distribution charges across the country because they have taken photos of themselves and sent it to a partner.
And so that's not illegal for an adult to do that, but it is illegal for a teenager to do it because then they unwittingly are trafficking in childhood pornography when it's a picture of themselves.
That's how it's been interpreted, yes. And it's important here to recognize that public policy and the legal system has not caught up with our technology in this way. And so there's this huge gap in how these technologies and sexuality are interacting with minors and what the law is doing to sort of deal with those situations.
I think that people probably perceive that they're being flirtatious, perhaps how to be flirtatious in a safe way that is not only legally safe, but also sexually safe.
Mm-hmm. I think having very matter-of-fact discussions are what's key here. So letting the child know what the legal limitations are, what is going on nationally, but also making sure to not necessarily shame them, and let them know that you are a resource for information, you are a resource for strategies to stay safe online, and bring in resources you can find on different online websites that talk about how to set age-appropriate limits.
Dr. Wenzel?
Yeah, I would just add to that, reassuring for your teenager, your adolescent, that it's very normal to be having sexual experiences and sexual feelings, and it's normal to be exploring those. And like adults, we have to sort of weigh the benefits and risks of doing that, whether that's actual sexual content or sending a sexually explicit photo or video to somebody. There are potential consequences there that can really last a long time. And so helping the teen and adolescent to kind of think through those risks and benefits becomes really important.
When it comes to porn literacy, we were talking about having a good comprehensive sexual education class. What would you want also to be included in that? I mean, we've been talking about that also, but just in our last moments here, what would you want to throw out there?
So many things.
So many things, yeah.
So many things.
You each do one.
I want us to all be mindful consumers, people who are critiquing the things that are being produced and things that are being watched, keeping in mind that they could very easily kind of end up in the hands of someone who is younger, who doesn't really have the information or the knowledge to really be able to put that information in the context. I would want to see consent being displayed, being normalized. So there being a verbal agreement between individuals who are involved in a sexual act.
I 100% agree. And I would also add, just on kind of a basic, where it maybe shouldn't be so basic, but it is level scientifically accurate information about anatomies and the fact that bodies are diverse, right? If we can talk to our teens and adolescents about naming their different body parts, this is toddlers even, we can talk about vulvas and penises and clitorises as perhaps they get older, right? Again, back to that age-appropriate, developmentally appropriate education.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would just put in a plug for the series of books that's called Free to Be Me. There's a series of kid books that are about both consent and sexual behavior and development that are really useful for the younger child, and I also think useful for the parent as you're trying to perhaps familiarize yourself with vocabulary or information that maybe you didn't get as a child or as a teen, and think about how can I arm myself with the vocabulary that my kids might be seeing so I can just be open and clear about what it is I want to say.
Absolutely. I would say anybody who's got teenagers right now probably more than likely did not have a conversation with their parents about the topic of sex, let alone even legitimizing the word by saying the word pornography. Yep. So it is a completely different day and age, and there's really no way around it. I mean, that technology, if you're not going to get your kid a smartphone, I had a sheriff's deputy once, we were listening to a conversation about online safety, said, if you didn't get your kid a cell phone, they probably already have one. You just don't know they do. And I went, oh my gosh. So it really is teaching your teenager how to use the power that is in that.
This is really about critical thinking skills at the end of the day, and I think we get so wrapped up and maybe excited about the content of what we're talking about here.
That's a great
but
point.
At the end of the day, this is really about critical thinking skills and decision-making skills.
Yeah.
And mutual
normalizing
respect.
conversation, for sure.
Yeah, when you put a taboo subject and it just crashes head on with technology, that's what's going to happen. Well, fabulous. Thank you so much for taking time with us today.
Thank you.
We've been talking about teens and pornography with 2 Mayo Clinic experts. Our thanks to Mayo Clinic psychologist Dr. Jennifer Wenzel and Dr. Dagoberto Herrera. Thanks again for being with us.
Thank you.